Welcome to podcast number 13 of On Air, which is a collaboration between Tesla 369 and Phoenician Hunter, which is based on the in-depth research conducted by Phoenician Hunter. So welcome to another episode, Phoenician Hunter.
Welcome, it's good to be back.
It's great to have you back as always. Well, today's podcast is titled New World Romans. Did the Romans follow the Phoenicians to the Americas? And this is going to be very interesting. Let's jump straight into it. Firstly, what I'd like to do before we hear from you is just to establish a reference point for any new listeners out there. In our last podcast, we presented evidence for the feasibility of transatlantic voyages in ancient times. Now, this was, if those that had listened to our last podcast or read your article on Substack, it was through the use of cross staffs, magnetic compasses, the sturdy vessels, etc. And maps, of course, which is the most important. So we wanted to continue this discussion and provide some further interesting finds that you've found from your research. So I'm interested, as I'm sure our listeners would be, what other evidence do you have to share?
Like you said in the previous discussion and article, we touched on, was it possible to make that voyage? And then when we looked at the evidence, we found that, yeah, it was. Then the next step would be, okay, is there any finds or artifacts or evidence that ancient peoples did actually make that voyage? And is there evidence in the Americas of it? So I went about looking for that. And yeah, there's plenty of recorded artifacts found in the Americas, pre-Columbus artifacts, mostly of Nordic, Phoenician and Roman origins. And I was surprised to find a large amount of Roman finds in my research because I would have limited it to Nordic and Phoenicians at the, going into this. So yeah, and then when I looked into the Roman finds closer, there was a sort of a Phoenician connection to those. And we'll get into that later in the chat and why I believe they're sort of connected to the Phoenicians. I came across some interesting artifacts that I haven't discussed in this article because I sort of wanted to make another part to it, which I didn't get around to doing yet. And some of these were, there was a Christian cross with Latin inscriptions found in Arizona, for instance, that, was quite fascinating. Okay. And a Roman sword discovered in the north off the coast of Oak Island. Okay. Yeah, so things like that and coins throughout the whole of, the continent. There's recorded finds of Roman coins of various ages. They were interesting as well.
You just mentioned earlier, and I just maybe quickly touch on it, you were surprised that there were Roman artifacts and you thought they would mostly be Nordic or Phoenician. The Nordic in particular, because we know through history that the Nordic people went literally all over the world. So that's not going to be surprising, correct?
Correct, and especially in the top part of America, the north, and they are recorded and pretty much established as orthodox history. A lot of historians are okay with those finds. They start to disagree with the older ones. So the Phoenicians and Romans, they don't tend to take those seriously, and they're the ones I really wanted to focus on. So that's why I haven't really focused on the Nordic ones. There's enough of that out there, in the common literature. So that, yeah.
Based on that, let's try and understand from you how that would have happened, how you think the Romans would have actually traveled to that distance. So, in our last podcast, again, as a reference point, provided evidence of your research that suggested some ice core samples, suggesting the climate of our planet, including the conditions of the oceans, which back then would have been a lot less volatile than they are today. And that basically changed, and sorry if I'm repeating myself, but again, this is just as a reference point, that changed quite dramatically towards the end of the 14th century. And when I say changed dramatically in terms of what we see today, in terms of the oceans and the size of the waves, etc., tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, that's a very important point that you brought up, and one that most researchers miss, neglect, or are unaware of. And to me, what the evidence is suggesting there is that, like you said, the oceans were easier to travel, to make that voyage across, right? So if the Phoenicians were able to do it, it sort of suggests that other ancient peoples after the Phoenicians were able to make that voyage as well. So that's when we look into the Greeks or the Romans, and the focus of this article is the Romans. So if the Carthaginians were able to do it, then then so would the Romans. So what I'm suggesting with the title, the subtitle, is did the Phoenicians follow the path of the Carthaginians to America? Because they would have been there first, and then the Romans would have gained that knowledge through them and followed suit. That's the path I was trying to investigate.
And that pretty much would make perfect sense too. So in your article, you mentioned the Azores Islands finds. And for those that aren't aware, the Azores Islands are a group of small volcanic islands in the North Atlantic Ocean, roughly about 1,400 kilometres west of Portugal. Can you give us a little bit more about that?
Now, they're located sort of between North America and Europe. So if one was to make that voyage, that could be a perfect stepping stone. So that was one area that I looked at and wanted to see if there was any evidence of any finds there. And there was. And there was one as early as the 1700s. 1778, there was an article that reported the discovery of Carthaginian coins. There we go again with the Carthaginians on one of those islands. And then as recent as 2010, there was a team of Portuguese archaeologists that conducted some digs there, and they found some very simple stone temples and structures that they believed belonged to the Carthaginians through, I don't know, the style, I guess, and the dating.
So can I ask you, and sorry to interject, but why would this be kept from the history? Now, okay, that's probably an open-ended question, but why do you think in this particular instance, when we're talking about transatlantic voyages, why would people want to push the Roman aspect aside?
I don't think they're pushing the Roman aspect aside. It's just that there seems to be more evidence for the Carthaginians because probably relates to the kind of people they were. Seafarers, merchants. Okay. Romans liked to stay on land. They didn't have a navy until very late in, their empire. So I think it's related to the kind of people that they are. And it's interesting that you brought that up, the narrative, for instance. What I find throughout all my research, I read a lot of books from the 1800s. Yes. I try to start as far back as possible.
Great.
Most modern research is conducted by reading older, what came before, okay? What I find is the narrative changes. Now, this is probably done by, we could say, the powers that control the minds of men,
yes,
for maybe reasons we're not aware of. The narrative of what they want to push changes with the decades and the centuries, and that probably has to do with who's in power at that time. So, for instance, if the Romans were in power, they would sort of push, a Roman narrative. At the moment, America is the global power. So they will push a certain narrative. And in China, for instance, amongst their own people and their own literature, they will push a certain narrative.
Sure.
So do the Russians. If Phoenicians, for instance, and Carthaginians were a talking point 100 years ago, and it might not be today. That's why you won't find it today. It's because it's not that the evidence has disappeared. It's just that the narrative has changed. So people are focusing on something else, or they're pushing us to look into another area or accept another point of view.
And I've spoken to other researchers like yourself, and I've done a lot of reading. And the common theme is they tell you if you want to learn the true history, that you look at publications that predate 1908, I think it is. And then, and the reason why it's 1908, because that's when a lot of the texts were reprinted with a different message. Now, people might say that's conspiratorial in thinking. And, we can talk about the Rockefellers and how they started to change that narrative. But for any of our listeners out there, the reason why your research is fantastic is because you don't take what's currently printed and you go way back pre-1800. So I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, good point. And my cutoff date is like 1940s.
Yes, okay.
Because I believe that's when the big shift happened in terms of who rules the modern world. I mean, for me, World War II was the point where the New World Order took over, or what we want to call, the ones that are in control today.
Of course, yeah.
And it's interesting you brought that Rockefeller up, because he also went about removing a lot of books and literature regarding health, right, and medication to push his new drugs and pharmaceutical. So this has happened across not just archaeology and history, it's also happened with medicine. And
yes, that's right.
And even science too. Sciences have been pushed into a certain area that pre-1900s, they were looking at something else. And, electric, they were looking at electric universe. And then they pushed it to the the black hole and all that kind of
Big
junk.
Bang,
And
the Big Bang,
string
and all that.
theory
String
came.
theory, exactly.
You know,
Yes, yes.
they keep changing the narrative.
Well, I take comfort in the fact that the reason why you and I collaborate in these podcasts and in other areas of history is because of your method of research. And your method of research is based on pre 1900, or you said 1940 and back, but
Yeah.
predominantly pre-1900 texts, which you then convert into plausible insights, and that's something that I find quite fascinating. So let's continue on the.
I just wanted to bring up another point because
Yeah, no,
we've gone off
please.
topic. It's interesting that I also read, in newer articles and books, and what I find is when they reference something, and I'm one of these people that, I look at the footnotes and I find the original books that
Okay.
note is referring to.
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of those books are again from the early 1800s or early
1800s, yeah.
1900s. So
Yeah.
I say to myself, I might as well just go back to the original, read the
Straight to the
original.
source. That's
Yeah,
right. That's
straight to
right.
the
Yeah.
source. So
That's
yeah, I'm one of
fantastic.
those nuts that goes way back and,
No,
and, and
but
looks at the footnotes.
But like I said, you can justify your insights based on that research, and I think it's quite refreshing to see people like yourself and others and other researchers that are in a similar vein actually go to that length to do it, to actually tell the true story. So let's continue on from the Azores Islands. What else is connected to that? What
Okay.
other finds?
Okay. Then I was looking at other finds, and I came across, as we all know, the Phoenicians are famous for producing the purple dye,
Yes.
or Tyrian dye, which was the cornerstone of their industry, which they sold all over the known world, and it became associated with royalty and priests and power
Yes.
and prestige, and it's still worn today.
In the Greek Orthodox religion, for example, the high priests and the bishops wear the purple robes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's
Exactly.
interesting.
So that dye was initially produced by using shellfish, a particular type of shellfish, and then they'll make that color. But what happened is, what I found in my research is towards the middle of the 8th century BC, a new type of purple dye was introduced into the Mediterranean, right? And what was quite fascinating about this new dye, purple dye, again by the Phoenicians, was that it wasn't made from shellfish. It was made from a specific fungus, and this particular fungus comes only from the Canary Islands.
The Canary Islands that we know today, which is that
Exactly.
small group of islands
Small,
off the coast of Africa,
yeah,
west of Morocco, thereabouts. Yeah.
yeah, and according to standard history, is that the Phoenicians were nowhere near that island. No ancient people made that voyage, and standard history tells us that it was only known in the 15th century when the Portuguese discovered it or rediscovered it.
Yeah,
So there's evidence there that those islands were visited by the Phoenicians.
And to back that up, because they're thousands of miles out into the Atlantic Ocean,
Yeah.
so we would suspect that it would have been difficult for anyone to find them, discover them, whatever. So
Exactly. But if we go back to what we said earlier about the ice core samples, it doesn't seem that fantastic because the
Yes.
conditions would have been ideal for that kind of voyage. So again, that is one of the most important aspects of this whole theory. I looked further into the Canary Islands and I discovered that there was some ancient sources saying that there was an expedition sent there by the Romans.
Is this Juba II, who was the king of Numidia in North Africa at the time?
That's the one, yeah, which
Right, okay.
was a former Phoenician colony.
That's right, yes.
But at that time, it was ruled by Rome. So,
Okay.
Any kind of expedition like that would have been overseen by the Romans if they were ruling over that territory.
Okay. Did he also claim to be some sort of descendant of someone? Is that, or
Yeah.
am I just mistaken?
No, of the famous General Hannibal.
Ah, yes, of
So
course, of course.
there's the connection to the Phoenicians again. So you got the Romans, and this is why I was saying earlier, a lot of these finds that are sort of attributed to the Romans are actually connected to the Phoenicians somehow, or the Carthaginians. That's what I keep finding, and we'll go through some others further down.
Okay.
So there was an expedition sent to the island, and in recent times they discovered that there was evidence there was a footprint of these Carthaginians or Romans there on the island. And I go into more detail in the article, like I would. We're just sort of touching on a few points here. Hanno the Navigator, he was a famous Carthaginian sailor. He's also attributed to discovering the Cape Verde Islands and also the country of Gabon in the 5th century BC. So this is like right at the bottom, towards the bottom of the continent of Africa. So we're finding evidence, right, of these ancient sailors making their way all around to the bottom of Africa. And if you recall in the previous podcast, we discussed the British adventurer Philip Bill, who was able to prove that he could make that voyage from Carthage or modern day Tunisia all the way to America. But he also made the voyage all around the continent of Africa because records suggested that that was something that the Carthaginians had achieved as well. So,
and I guess they, you found this in your research. A lot of historians often, put the claim together that, the Phoenicians kept their voyages and knowledge of foreign countries a secret, and they would purposely go out there and spread all these horrific stories about the perils of the outer sea, about these large sea monsters, etc., to discourage others to do that voyage, right? And this is what Philip Beale tried to disprove, correct?
Exactly. And I think they were mostly doing that to sort of just keep those new lands and resources to themselves, as you would, if you're, especially as a merchant.
Yeah.
And they were able to do this also by establishing a blockade of the Straits of Gibraltar, which was sort of the entry point into the Mediterranean from the Atlantic and vice versa, right? So their vessels were the only ones that were able to venture out into the Atlantic. And that's how they say they traveled to England as well and to the Baltic areas because they were the only ones with access. But this all changed with the fall of Carthage when Carthage was destroyed by the Romans. So from that point on, Greek vessels and Roman vessels could begin to go out into the Atlantic themselves.
Oh, okay. So this is why you mentioned earlier, this is why Roman coins were found all over the Americas.
Exactly.
Right. It makes
so this
sense.
would have happened soon after the fall of Carthage, because before that point, they sort of held that area to themselves. They blocked anyone coming in. So yeah, then we start to see perhaps if they could do it, then other ancient peoples would have attempted to make that same voyage and try and discover what was out there. And also follow into the footsteps of the Carthaginians, and maybe I heard this story that they were chasing them. There could have been naval battles, and they were chasing the Carthaginians, out into the Atlantic. Where are these people going? Let's chase them and then follow them that way, and perhaps even not knowing where they were going, accidentally found new lands that way.
So in terms of the Roman coins, when were these discovered?
So Roman coins are recorded, the earliest account appear soon after the discovery of America by Columbus. So one of the earliest is 1533, so it's quite a way back. And that one was bearing the image of Caesar Augustus.
Oh wow!
And it was found in the gold mines of Panama. But then you hear stories that experts say, oh yeah, but they were brought there by European travelers. Like a European traveler had a Roman coin on him at the time or something.
Right.
This is what they claim, and then dropped it.
So to debunk that notion, if it was the Romans, would there have been a shipwreck, for example? Because I know that you mentioned that there was the discovery of a Roman shipwreck found in Brazil near Rio de Janeiro. Is that right?
Yeah, well, see, I came across this fascinating discovery, I guess, years ago, and it sort of came out of nowhere and then disappeared quickly. And, I have spoken to a few other people, and almost everyone's unaware of it because they've buried it. It's like it sort of just disappeared, from the literature. So I went looking for that, and I was able to find some old articles about it. And this was like in 1982. There was an American marine archaeologist, name was Robert Marks.
Okay.
And he obtained permission from the Brazil. So, and actually, yeah, if you look into this guy, he's quite well known and respected in the community. So what he did was he obtained permission from the Brazilian government, right, to explore the Bay of Rio de Janeiro because two local divers had found two complete ceramic jars, and they call them amphoras.
Amphoras, yes.
Amphoras jars, which are those long, thin ceramic jars that the ancient peoples used to store food or oil or olives and for long voyages, and also for the merchants used to store their merchandise in them.
Okay.
So I just want to point out that it wasn't just the Romans that used those; the Greeks used them, and the Carthaginians used them. Again, we're back to them, and the Phoenicians used them. So
and it's not as if they just found one jar, right?
well, initially they found two, and then he wanted to go, this Robert Max wanted to explore it further. So when he went down, they found about 200 broken jars.
Yeah, okay.
And when they brought it back to an expert, the expert said that they were very similar to ones produced in Morocco in the ancient times. At the time, Morocco was a Roman colony.
Yes.
So that's where that's where he established a connection to okay, these belong to ancient Rome. They're ancient Roman artifacts. But looking into it, Morocco triggered something in me, and I said, okay, Morocco. But Morocco was what? Phoenician. It was Carthaginian before it was a Roman colony. So we go back. So perhaps these were Carthaginians, not Roman jars.
Right, okay. And just for a little bit more information, what I read was that Robert Marks and his obviously archaeology team, they used these sound echoes, like acoustical echoes and long rods to find these pots. Is that right?
Well, they use those, I think, when they're trying to look for something deeper or something they can't get to.
Can you tell us? Oh, they did do it, yes?
Yeah, they did. They managed to do that from the surface, right?
Right.
So what they found is below these pots were the remains of a wooden wreck, right?
There you go.
That was shattered upon impact of a large rock. So, so that makes sense, And then he suggested that this would have been the Roman vessel that was, carrying these pots, and it was. And he was suggesting that it was probably blown off course, and it reached, all the way to Brazil from, the Mediterranean or the Atlantic opening there. What happened next was quite interesting because then Marx had prepared to return to do, a full-blown excavation of the site, right? But then when he returned, he said that he found that the site had been buried under a large mound of a thick layer of silt, which is sort of like this hardened clay.
Clay, yeah.
Almost hardened like concrete. So you couldn't get to it. That's what he claims. Now, the Brazilian government denied this and they labeled him a hoaxer, and they didn't allow him to enter the country. And they started saying that, he was stealing artifacts from other various sites and, putting them on the black market, selling them.
This is a similar story to, and it's slightly off topic here, but the pyramids of Giza, when British archaeologists went in there sort of like late 1800s and they found that, say, the Pyramid of Giza, for example, wasn't an actual temple to the pharaohs, etc. They discovered all this new evidence. The Egyptian government literally told them to leave and never to return because they obviously had discovered something that they shouldn't have. So it's like a carbon copy. One happens in Brazil, one happens in Egypt. So it's controlling the narrative to a large degree.
Exactly, and you'll find this happens all over the world. So in the early 90s, there was this British researcher, author named John Anthony West, and he was one of the first to go to Egypt and start questioning the date of the Sphinx and the pyramids, and he was saying it was a lot older and it couldn't have been built by the Egyptians. Now, a lot of other people, what we call now New Age researchers, have taken his research and taken it to the next level, or distorted it or whatever. Anyway, this guy produced a great documentary for listeners if you want to watch it. It's called The Mystery of the Sphinx, 1993, I think it was. John Anthony West. So look him up and look at that documentary. To me, it's still the best documentary on Egypt produced to this day.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, he went in there, started questioning all this stuff, and then the Egyptian archaeologist Zahir Hawass, who was head of
Yes, that's right.
antiquities,
I remember that.
banned him. This is when it sort of started. They started banning a lot of archaeologists and foreign researchers, and they wanted to keep it Egyptian. So if you're saying no, it doesn't belong to the Egyptians, there goes the prestige of the Egyptians and the
your whole history and
yeah,
culture
exactly.
and stuff.
So this happens quite often. It happens in Turkey more recently. So back to the article, that's what I think happened in Brazil. The Brazilian government didn't want to change their history. Didn't want to say we're linked to the Portuguese. If you're saying that Romans got here first, opens up a can of worms.
Of course.
They don't want to touch it. So I think that's what happened to Robert Max and his team. So they banned him, covered up the evidence, and many such cases.
But there were also, and predating Marx, there were also some small terracotta head, or a small terracotta head that was found near Mexico City. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Then again, I was trying to find Roman
Evidence.
artifacts that could continue with the theme of these, the Roman shipwreck and Roman coins, and what else could I find? And there was a find in Mexico, like you say, in 1933. And it was a small terracotta head, which was dated to the Roman period of the 2nd to 3rd century AD.
Okay, well, there is a quote in your article that states the stylistic examination tells us more precisely that it is a Roman work from around the 2nd century AD. And the hairstyle and the shape of the beard present the typical traits of the Severan emperors period, which is around 193 to 235 AD, exactly in the fashion of the epoch.
So again, looking at Roman finds, and then I find this clue. And for people who don't know, the Severan emperors were from Carthage.
Yes.
So Punic descent again. So there again is this Phoenician connection to all these Roman finds. Again, is it really Roman? Are these finds really Roman? Because the way I look at it, they can be Roman, but they can also be Carthaginian, that misinterpreted as Roman. Okay, so that was the conclusion that I came to after looking at all these artifacts. Then after the Punic War, the Third Punic War, when Carthage was destroyed, we either have some Carthaginians fleeing to a safe haven, and because they already knew of the Americas, maybe some of them went there. And then, we're just going to speculate here. Maybe some of the Romans followed them, right? Where are these people going? Let's find their secrets. Where are their resources? Where are their other, colonies, their bases, and probably found them that way.
Yeah, but it's quite plausible that would have happened.
Yeah, we don't really know, but there is that connection with the Phoenicians. So
what can we take from all of this, from the previous podcast and continuation to this podcast? Do you want to put a stake in the sand to say that this is what I think has happened?
No, because there's still a lot of work to be done, and like I said, I think I mentioned it in the last podcast, that there's talk of Phoenician artifacts in as far as Australia, Indonesia, Asia, that way. And then, there are stories of what we would call, the merchants of Phoenicia in India, and Indian researchers, point to this. So was this a global empire? Was this global empire then taken over by the Romans? Because what we find in the Mediterranean is after the fall of Carthage, Rome takes over all their colonies, basically. So that's the point where Rome becomes the global power, of the known world at that time. When only when they destroy Carthage. Okay, so Carthage was the global empire before Rome, and then Rome takes its seat. So I'm thinking, did Rome continue that expansion? Did it venture out and find its other colonies, or did the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians flee to these secret locations? So we don't really know. So there's more work
Well,
to be done there.
well, for me, based on the last or the last podcast and this one, regarding specifically the ice samples that have been taken to show that the climate was completely different to what it is today, or from the 1400s onwards, we can cite a number of references globally that could justify this journey of the Romans. And one example that comes to mind for me is the Egyptian hieroglyphics that are found in Australia, as far as Australia. Now, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but
Yeah, I
there's a
am.
cave in Queensland, I think it is,
Yeah.
that has Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it was said that the ancient Egyptians had very close ties, particularly spiritual ties, to the indigenous people, or the Aborigines as they're called today. So that makes perfect sense for you to say that the Romans travelled to the Americas, because if the Egyptians could travel to Australia, then sure, it was possible.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the Egyptians because they also had a strong connection with the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were their merchant traders, were their sailors, and so maybe that story with the Egyptian connection with Australia were actually the Phoenicians,
Right.
and maybe there could have been they were Phoenician ships, Phoenician sailors. Maybe there were some Egyptians on board.
Have you done any research into this,
A little
or
bit.
okay?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, again, when I hear those stories, just like here with the Romans, I think maybe there's something else behind it, and I was able to
Mm-hmm.
connect those so-called Roman finds to Carthaginian or Phoenician connection, and perhaps that story with the Egyptians also has a Phoenician underbelly to it as well. But again, there needs a little bit more research involved in that.
Well, it's been yet another fascinating discussion, because it's taken us to other areas rather than the Carthaginians and the Phoenicians and the ancient Greeks and the Romans, etc. If I could just again point our listeners to your Substack channel, which is at phoenicianhunter.substack.com, because you'll find not only the literary version of this podcast, but the previous 12 podcasts that we've done are based on your research and your findings. Are there any final words that you'd like to convey? Should we continue this discussion in another podcast, or what are your thoughts moving forward?
Well, see, this line of research has sort of ended with this article so far. There were so many other interesting finds that I wanted to research further, but I haven't been able to because my research has led me into other directions. But I will at some point write a continuation or leading on from this at some point, but it hasn't happened yet. And I like to remind people, I know it's probably getting boring, that this isn't a full-time gig for me, so I have to juggle this with work commitments and also family
Family
commitments. And it's
commitments.
something I've noticed with a lot of content producers, that a lot of them are very are single, don't have
Mm-hmm.
family commitments, are younger. I like to see them try it when they got family to
Well,
contend with. But
if we can perhaps even tell our listeners that the work that we do is done on our free time. We would welcome any support from any listeners out there that want to hear stories about the ancients, and any specific, I guess, research that you've done that they would like to hear more of. We welcome any support that our listeners and our subscribers are willing to offer, because, like you said, this is not a full-time gig for either you or I, but we are excited at being given the opportunity to convey this history that is an untold narrative.
Yeah, good point. So I don't have an article that sort of follows on from this one, but as I've mentioned before, that all my articles are part of a larger story. So maybe the natural follow-on from this would be, what happened to the Carthaginians after the fall of Carthage? Where did they go? What happened to them? And I've written an article called More Than Meets the Eye, the Phoenicians Resurrected, and what I believe happened to them, and how they resurrected and regained their power and regained their former colonies. So that might be a good
That,
podcast for next week.
That would be a perfect segue into the next podcast. Look, once again, it's been a great discussion. We always have off the cuff chats, which, as you've said, your research is interconnected. So again, I encourage our listeners to go and have a look at your Substack channel if they want to learn more. But for the time being, thanks again for your insights. Thanks for the discussion. It's been great having you. And I look forward to, again, our next chat, as you've just stated.
Thank you. Till next week.
Till next week, stay well.